Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing very well. Today, well, in this video, I want to talk about emotions and depersonalization. Excuse me. But before I do that, good news first. There will be a strike the strike has been called off. So very good news for all our students. Very good news for employees, and just in general, very good news for all the colleges across Ontario. Okay, so let's put that aside. Go back to business as usual, and talk about emotions and depersonalization. So in order to do that, I will share my screen with you. So as you remember, this is the diagram from the end of the chapter on emotions by Northoff. And I like this diagram because it's simple, but quite informative at the same time. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have the brain specific, and Northoff talked about and cited specific literature on neuroscientific literature, which parts of the brain are involved in generating emotions or emotional feelings. He also looked at specific theories and how they try to explain emotional feelings or emotional states. You have also learned that the insular cortex seems to be quite important for representing information, I should say, representing information that is interoceptive, or the feelings that we get from inside our organisms or inside our bodies, and what happens exteroceptively or outside of our bodies. So there are naturally, as you can see, it makes sense for an organism to have, especially organisms such as human beings, but other mammals and other organisms as well, to have specific brain regions or brain capacity for an organism to have a relationship with its environment. So actually on two counts, with two environments, with the internal environment of its body, okay, interoception or homeostasis. So we have the brainstem, the hypothalamus especially, but also the organism vis-a-vis or in reference to its environment. And as you can imagine, if the central nervous system was not equipped with specific brain regions to do so, it would be very difficult for an organism to survive. Okay, now specific brain regions and specific brain mechanisms, or you could say neurochemistry, gives rise to specific feelings or specific emotions, or what Northoff calls existential feelings. And I will get to that in a second, which are basically a reaction to what is happening externally to a given individual or an organism. And as you can see, the causal roots go both ways. The central nervous system sets in a specific emotional reaction or emotional feelings in an organism or an individual. And that is either a reaction to what is happening in the world or in its world, exteroceptively, that is, and which also triggers specific reactions to the organism in terms of its behavior in a given world. And I think what is happening right now, especially in Ukraine, exemplifies this quite well. exemplifies this what Northrop calls existential feelings. And this mutual causal relationship between these three components: the brain, the overall organism, and its relationship to its environment. When you listen to the migrants or refugees coming from Ukraine, especially when they are fleeing Ukraine and they're on their way to Poland or Moldova or Romania or other countries neighboring that are neighbors to Ukraine or that share a border with Ukraine, you can see that Northrop is accurate in his description that emotions are really existential feelings. Now, when you listen to the migrants, they say things such as they are in disbelief, or they say it feels surreal. It does not feel real what is happening to them, because they are in a state of shock. And the state of shock is intimately connected to the emotions that they feel. They feel a very heightened level of arousal. They are very anxious about their position in the world. That is coupled with specific emotions such as anger, deep frustration, extreme worry, extreme fear. Okay, that's part and parcel of overall anxiety. Which then triggers such claims about it not being real. What is happening around them is not real, because of the stark difference between what they had experienced 2 weeks prior, or 3 weeks prior, or maybe a month earlier. So a month earlier, the world made sense to them. They had a home, they had plans, they had children with specific plans going to school, and so on and so forth. The war starts, it changes, and when it starts, it changes their world enormously. You could say their world is turned upside down. And this is reflective by the language that Ukrainian people use. They say that they are in shock. They say that they are in disbelief. It feels like a dream. It doesn't feel real, because of the magnitude of the stimulus. And the stimulus here is the Russian attack on Ukrainian people. And the Russian attack, it's so abrupt and severe that it steers up acute emotional reactions in individuals. And when individuals go through such acute emotional reactions, then it basically represents or defines their position in the world in that moment. And that is why Northrop says that such emotions are really existential feelings. They represent or define what an individual feels at the moment in his or her world. So when people decide to flee, when people decide to run, it's basically that reaction is basically a reaction to the emotional state that they are in. And so one causal root is from the world to the organism. The world, in this case, the war triggers specific reactions, emotional reactions in an individual, and that causes or motivates an individual to affect the world immediately or directly. That's why we have a causal arrow going from an individual or from an organism to the world, because individuals or Ukrainians and Russians too if you have noticed, decide to flee, decide to leave their homes, decide to leave their country. And they know they're not coming back. That's why they are distraught. That's why they are extremely anxious about their position. And that's why they are extremely worried for their families in the future, and also the families that they leave behind, or husbands who they leave behind, especially women with young children. So the war in the world, in this case, the war, and specifically Russia as the aggressor, triggers specific emotional reactions, and then the emotional reactions then in effect cause specific behaviors. That is, behavior of fleeing, migrating, becoming a refugee. So the world affects the central nervous system in a specific way, specific regions of the brain, and which then that immediately leads to specific emotional reactions. And this, as you know, happens very quickly because all of you have experienced this and do experience on a regular basis. It's really no different, maybe not in the same magnitude, but it's really no different in the case of being a student when you realize that there's an exam coming up, when you realize that there is a research paper coming up and you haven't done any studying, or you haven't started writing, you haven't done researching, and so on. But even before that, just the thought of there being an exam or a test triggers anxiety, triggers the level of stress goes up. When the level of stress goes up, it triggers specific emotions. Overall anxiety, worry, frustration, self-doubt, and it usually is associated with overall displeasure, discomfort, as opposed to comfort, relaxation, elation, happiness. Elation or happiness or comfort comes after after stress levels goes down. That is, after the exam, after you submit your research papers, or after you receive your grades. You put in all this work. You have been motivated by your emotions to do all this work because you have specific aspirations, and then the level of stress goes down once you find out that you get an A, that is. And if the grade that you get does not align with your goals or your aspirations, then you become disappointed, and that triggers disappointment is an emotional reaction. So you can see that emotional reactions define how we feel existentially in a world, and what we also have to do existentially in a world as organisms or as individuals. That emotional feelings are basically, they motivate us to do the things that we do on a regular basis. So when you feel hungry, you make food, you go shopping. When you miss someone, you want to see them. When your life is threatened by an aggressor, in this case, in the case of Ukraine, it's by the Russian government, then or the leader of that government, which is Vladimir Putin, then that triggers specific emotions. It triggers specific emotions, and then that triggers specific action. So individuals or group of individuals then has specific impact on the world around them. And again, it's no different from our world. We are not faced with such grave existential crises, but we are still in a pandemic, and that has caused many of us to experience anxiety or heightened anxiety, prolonged anxiety, symptoms of depression, sleepless nights, because all of a sudden there is there is a threat in the world that did not exist before. And the threat is external, it is exteroceptive, and it basically affects human beings mostly negatively. And this negativity is represented by specific emotional states. So as you have seen, we have had protests, we have had people, you know, either the pandemic has had debilitating, crippling effect, lots of worry, frustration, overall dissatisfaction and pain for millions and really actually billions of people around the world. So again, I think the claim here, existential, reflects the relationship, the emotional relationship that we have with our world and what unfolds in our world on a regular basis. So whether it's our emotional reactions to the pandemic, questions such as what will happen tomorrow, I'm worried, I'm stressed out, I'm frustrated, or whether it's a reaction to a war conflict, or whether it's a reaction to, you know, typical reaction to being a student on a regular basis, which is also quite stressful because as students, you have to manage, you have to juggle many things at the same time. And many of you study on a regular basis. The workload is not light, but you also have part-time jobs on the side, which creates additional stress, and it evokes specific emotions, especially when things don't go your way. So when you consider all of these examples, you can see that the term existential feelings for overall emotional states is accurate because it reflects or it represents what an individual or an organism feels in its environment, and what such feelings cause the individual to do, what they motivate a given individual to do in such circumstances. Okay, so now let's move on to depersonalization. Now, depersonalization is basically taking away the emotional feelings, or taking away, more accurately, depersonalization is, you could say, a blunting or negating the typical familiar emotional reactions or feelings we have to the world, to the external world, and to the world to the interoceptive world, the world that takes place inside of our bodies or organisms. So when you read some of the testimonies of people who suffer from depersonalization, for example, in states of heightened and prolonged stress, so you have in some testimonies you read that people say, when I kiss my daughter goodnight, I know I'm kissing her goodnight, but it doesn't have, I don't have the typical emotional feelings. I don't care as much for let me rephrase that. When a mother says that, she expects a specific emotional reaction when she kisses her daughter goodnight. But when the typical emotional reaction of care or love is not there, then the mother or a person in such a case feels that there's something missing. Okay, and that something missing is basically depersonalization. It's blunting or removal of typical emotional reactions to the interoceptive world and the exteroceptive world. So in the case of kissing, the mother kissing her daughter goodnight is a removal of the typical familiar feelings related to care and love for her daughter. The other example is, a mother who gets the news that receives the news that her son is in jail, and she says, "I know that he's in jail, but I'm not crying. I don't have the typical stressful reactions. I don't have the typical worrisome reactions to what is happening to my son. I should, but I don't." So again, this is an example of depersonalization, when our emotions are not, it's not that our emotions and our typical feelings are obliterated, they are negated, they do not exist. That's not the case. They're just basically dialed down, but they're dialed down so much so that we have, it triggers a stressful reaction from us, and we ask question, okay, what is happening? Why is it that I do not have this typical or familiar reaction, emotional reaction to the world, or to the world that is happening, to the interoceptive world or exteroceptive world? What is happening? And then that has a kind of a feedback effect, a biofeedback effect, if you will. So, an individual, a mother does not have the typical emotional reactions. Perhaps it is due to prolonged stress that are unrelated to her daughter, but perhaps other aspects in her life. The effect of that is that depersonalization sets in. And then once depersonalization sets in, it triggers additional worry and stress because the mother doesn't know what is happening to her. Okay, so that is the effect of depersonalization. That's what depersonalization is, and that is commonly how it is affected. It could be affected by heightened and prolonged stress, but it could also be affected by experimenting with alcohol or various drugs. But it could also set in without such causes. You could feel depersonalized, or the symptoms of depersonalization, after a couple of sleepless nights, or maybe even one sleepless night. Maybe you stay up all night and studying or writing, and because of that, you have symptoms of depersonalization, or you experience depersonalization. And it's temporary, it doesn't last long, but in some cases, it lasts quite long. So depersonalization is the blunting or dialing down human emotional experiences, or just basically human emotions. And because of that, our experiences of ourselves, our emotional reactions to the world changes. So that is depersonalization. And then derealization is when we or subjects say that they don't feel that the world external to them is real. So depersonalization is when we say, or subjects or patients, when they say they don't feel real to themselves, they don't feel the same familiarity, the typical, we can say, warm and fuzzy feelings that come with specific emotions. Okay, that is blunted, that is dialed down, if you will. substantially so that it triggers anxiety in individuals. But derealization is when we have the same feelings about the world, not about our emotions, but about the world external to us. And individuals say that the world does not feel real. It feels like a movie. Interestingly, in the article on depersonalization, the researchers that are cited also make reference to the amygdala and the insula, or the insular cortex. That there is, what you will see through imaging is that the insular cortex goes through abnormal activities when patients go through or experience depersonalization or derealization. So the insula here seems to be quite important in representing emotional states to its individual, to the body that it exists in, or to the person that it exists in. So again, it is important to note that depersonalization is not the complete removal of any emotional experiences. That's not the case, but it's basically the blunting or lack of typical familiar emotional experiences. Basically, emotional experiences, or the tone of emotional experiences, or the magnitude of emotional experiences is dialed down, it's turned down, so much so that it, in effect, causes additional stress. And then you can see that there's this vicious cycle and or feedback loop then that triggers more anxiety and perhaps more intense experiences of depersonalization or derealization, if depersonalization or derealization is connected to heightened and prolonged stress. Okay, so how does Buddhism fit into this story? Because the title of the article is Depersonalization, Enlightenment's Evil Twin. Now, one of the principles or pillars of Buddhism, or some schools of Buddhism, but not all schools of Buddhism, is that the best way to live in the world is to act as a spectator, to be a bit removed from the world. And what they mean by that is to be less attached to the world. Because if you're less attached, not detached, that's not what they're saying, but less attached to the world, if you can practice that with the use of meditation, then basically you will be happier. You will have a better perception and a better relation to the world, and therefore you will be happier. Because as you can see, and as you can probably tell based on your own experiences, we get overly invested in the world emotionally. We get invested emotionally with our families, with our loved ones, with our boyfriends or girlfriends, wives, husbands, friends. We swing emotionally on a regular basis, and that is hard on us. Even though we go through many positive emotions, but we also go through many negative emotions, and that takes emotional toll on us. And in order to mitigate this, in order to blunt it a little bit, Buddhists say, okay, practice if you can through specific methods, and meditation is one of them. Practice a bit of practice removal from the world. Don't be so invested, don't be so attached to the world, because when you are overly attached to objects and people, then disappointment and suffering, dukkha means suffering, is just around the corner. So they're not saying you can eliminate suffering. They're not saying that you can eliminate the magnitude of emotional expressions or feelings, but some Buddhist schools stress that there is a way, there's a method of dealing with the world in a better way, so that we are happier at the end of the day, and that to them means practicing detachment, practicing removal from the world, not complete, but basically dialed down attachment to the world. And then there are, everyday examples of this, right? If you care about someone and then that person does not care about you, right? Then that lack of reciprocity, emotional reciprocity, hurts us or hurts the other person. If you care for something like an object, let's say, you care about your cell phone, right? Because the cell phone has many information, has a lot of information, and it basically represents your connection to many other people or the world, which is in itself quite remarkable how one object can do that. So a Buddhist would say, you should practice restraint. You shouldn't be as attached to your cell phone, because when something happens to your cell phone, either breaks, goes missing, or you lose it, then you panic. It sets in an existential feeling. Oh no, what will I do with my life now that my cell phone is broken, or doesn't work, or I lose it, or whatever it may be. You feel like, for a moment, you feel like your world is crashing. So, which in itself, I think, is a bit funny, but because there are more important things in the world than cell phones, obviously. But that's how we feel. That's how we feel in such moments, because of our emotional reactions. So, what Buddhists would say is, treat it like any other object. Don't get so involved. Don't get so emotionally attached to it. Don't put so much emphasis on your relationship with your phone. Build other relationships, or just don't treat it as importantly as you do. And when you do that, then you will be less hurt by what happens to the object of your desire, which is, in this case, is your phone. It could be a car, it could be a home, it could be a pair of pants, it could be your hair, it could be your skin. We're all attached emotionally to our bodies, to the objects that surround us, and to the people and our relationships with them. And because of that, we go through specific emotional states. And because of that, we are hurt and we suffer on a regular basis. It is impossible to weed out suffering, and it is impossible to weed out stress. That is part and parcel of what it is to be a human being in this world. Buddhists are not saying that you should do that, but what you should do in order to live a happier life, or less, or to go through, to be less hurt by the world because of our typical attachments to it. You should practice meditation. You should practice removal. You should practice a detachment from the world, especially from things that are not that important. So that is how the Buddhist story fits here, because once you practice meditation, one of the effects of meditation is the experience of depersonalization or derealization. It's basically what you're doing is when you're meditating, you are rewiring your brain, and the rewiring of your brain affects specific parts of your brain. It affects the midline structure and it affects the insular cortex. And when it affects the insular cortex, then that also affects your subjective emotions, the experience of your subjective emotions and your relationship to the world. It might change your the emotional tone or magnitude of your emotions to the world. And that can be perceived as stressful, that can be perceived as pathological, that can be perceived as unusual and scary for an individual. So that is why Buddhists say that meditation, the effects of meditation for some people, especially Westerners, is depersonalization. And in this case, since depersonalization can have a debilitating effect on individuals, they call it enlightenment's evil twin. Because on one hand, you are becoming more enlightened through practices that place emphasis on detaching yourself a little bit from the world. But the effect of it for some people is that they feel depersonalization, which is a negative emotion or a negative psychological state. Okay, so I think I will leave it at this and rejoin the discussion boards. And I'm quite curious what are your reactions to this chapter? And in terms of logistics, I will start posting your grades from discussion boards, and we will be up to date moving forward next week. So again, good news. We have averted a strike and we can go back to business as usual. So, or studying as usual. And I'm actually very happy about that. And I think you are as well. On that note, enjoy your weekend and I will talk to you soon. Take care.